And joining us now is our international affairs commentator, Douglas Herbert. So, Doug, these protests, as we just saw, are continuing across France. We haven't heard from President Macron yet publicly. Do we have any indication as what he's thinking?
Well, yeah, and we've been getting a lot of indications. First of all, those street protests show what the people are thinking, what a lot of the people who remain staunchly opposed to this reform are thinking. No signs that these protests are going to subside anytime soon. On the contrary, they look like they could actually be gaining some steam, gaining some momentum. Look, right now, we do sort of know what's going through Macron's mind. We have French democracy in sort of a split-screen mode right now, if you will. Imagine on the one hand, you have a notion of democracy as embodied, as personified by the will of the people as expressed on the street. In these types of street protests that we've seen, in which you see plumes of tear gas rising above the crowd, as was the case last night in central Paris on Place de la République, where there were projectiles thrown and some trash cans set afire, but also a lot of just simply peaceful protesters wanting, as they see it, their voice to be heard, feeling that their voice has obviously not been heard until now. So you have that form of protest, and they see themselves as sort of the exemplars, if you will, of democracy. Democracy as it's been in France. Democracy as it was put forth in 1789 in the French Revolution. Democracy as we've seen it in numerous instances, whether 1848, whether in 1968 with the student protests on the street and the barricades. They see that as the embodiment of democracy. Now, Emmanuel Macron, on the other hand, has a slightly different version. I want you to first see a quote. And remember, all of this on the hours before his interview. This is what is sort of leaked out of his meetings with advisors and allies from his parliamentary majority grouping in Parliament and his prime minister yesterday, saying the crowd has no legitimacy in the face of the people who express themselves sovereignly through their elected representatives. Riots do not prevail over the representatives of the people. Macron looks at these street protests and all he says, he sees a rowdy, boisterous, chaotic, out-of-control mob that is trying to impose its will over the properly democratic institutions. The parliament for Macron is the rightful vehicle for debating these types of things. And he and his Prime Minister Elizabeth Borne have stressed in recent days, from their point of view, the people's elected representatives in Parliament, whether the people agree with this or not, or want to agree with this, had 170 hours plus debate. Yeah, they ended up losing the censure vote by nine votes. It was very close. They almost succeeded in overturning the government, but they didn't, Macron would say. And in a democracy, there are losers, winners. Whether you like it or not, sometimes you're on the losing end of a vote. Even if you were bitterly disappointed, you have to accept those results. Elizabeth Borne sort of alluded to this last week in Parliament when she basically accused the fringe members of Parliament on the far right, the far left, those who were very boisterous and preventing her essentially from speaking, of basically sabotaging, hijacking the democratic process and the democratic institutions by saying they're engaging in anti-parliamentary, anti-democratic, and anti-constitutional behavior. Now, what's he going to say today? I'll tell you what he's not going to say, Emmanuel Macron, given all this, when he appears at 1 p.m. It's going to be a TV interview, I stress, not an address to the nation, not a formal speech. It's going to be in the middle of the day also when a lot of people are at work. So don't expect him to apologize. Macron is, if nothing but wed to his conviction that what he is doing is the right thing for France. He doesn't like this reform, but he thinks it's a bitter pill and necessary. He does believe that he is helping the French people, far from holding them in contempt as the people protesting say he's doing. He says not passing this law, not pushing through this reform would be to hold the French people in contempt by making their lives economically and socially harder in the long run. Dissolving Parliament, he's not going to do that. He's not going to call a referendum, even though the opposition has asked the Constitutional Council to consider that. He's not going to fire his Prime Minister Elizabeth Borne, and he's not going to take back the reform.
Certainly he wants to turn the page from all of this. Can he turn the page?
Yeah, Macron, you look at it right now, and if you're just sort of taking the aerial view of what's going on right now, you see a parliament set against him. At least a very vocal, opposition parties. You see these protests on the streets. You see far-right rivals in the wings gearing up for the 2027 election. Macron, remember, he's in his second term. He has 4 years left. That's a lot of time politically. And he knows that he has nothing to lose. He's going to push through his agenda because he believes that he doesn't have to go back to the ballot box. He sees how divided Parliament is. Yeah, he sees a lot of anger, visceral hatred towards him on the streets, but he also knows Parliament's divided. That could work in his favor in the long run. So he is looking sort of at the long game, and he still thinks that he has a lot of cards up his sleeve in order to ride this out and perhaps win the day in the end.
Okay, international affairs commentator Douglas Herbert. Doug, thanks as always.